so forth, was that one of the best, probably the best thing on economics comes out of Proverbs, written by Solomon. Proverbs is a book that Solomon wrote for his son Rehoboam, who was probably a teenager when he wrote the book, but when Solomon wrote the book. But what it does is it explains economics. And economics is explained in one sentence. Matter of fact, it's not just explained once in one sentence, it's explained twice in one sentence. This is how complete the Bible is, all right? Let's take a look at this. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7. That one doesn't work, does it? Let's try another one. Okay. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7. Okay. That's not really great. Let's try another one. Okay. Says that the rich rules over the poor and the borrower is the servant to the lender. Now, I think that probably the reason that it was written in the old Hebrew language is it was such a precise language at that time. You could actually put it into formulas or make equations out, if you will. So let's make a formula out of language because it says it twice. Once, the rich rules over the poor. Secondly, the borrower is servant to the lender. See, it says the same thing twice. Okay? To formulate it, it says the rich, okay, rule, actually the rich rule, okay, over the poor. That's the first thing it says. Then you can make a little plus over here. And it says the borrower is the servant, or the slave in some versions, slave to the lender. Isn't that interesting? So, now I have this, not only had the fun of raising some kids, but now I've got grandkids to raise, okay? And they ask you all these questions. It's kind of, kids want to know the answer. They don't want to fool around with a bunch of gobbledygook, okay? So, all right, if a kid were to ask you now what a ruler is, how would you explain what a ruler is? What would you say? See, because if you say it's a king, that's not always true. If you say it's a president, because these guys aren't always ruling, are they? See, the answer comes right out of Solomon. Now, we've had 4,000 years to know whether Solomon knew what he was talking about or not. See, he was the richest man who ever lived and the wisest man who ever lived, in some respects. In some respects, he wasn't too smart. But on money, he was pretty smart. Okay? Okay, a ruler, got it? Ready? We're ready for some real economics. Is a rich lender. There hasn't been any deviation in that definition for 4,000 years. That is definitely the ruler. The servant or the slave is the poor borrower. Now, when we go to business school at People's Republic of Berkeley or Harvard or something like this, what do we learn? We learn how to get out and borrow money so we can start a business, don't we? See? Notice? Wrong. That's not what we should be learning. So they teach us, it's really slave school. We got a catalog from Harvard, and we thought maybe they would teach it different. We learned how to get to Washington. It seems that you go to Harvard and turn left. Okay, so what happens, you see, is that the whole education system is to put you under external control. Isn't that interesting? Do we understand why the manifesto says that the government must run all schools? Because that's what's going to be taught. This is the progressive education of John Dewey. This was started by Horace Mann back 40 years ago. And it's been culminated now into our present economic or education system, which has no education in it at all. All it is external indoctrination. Any learning is purely coincidental. Okay, now, this is economics. Some people understand it and some people don't. One guy who understood it, very smart guy, was a guy born in Italy by the name of Cosimo Medici. Cosimo Medici started a bank in the year 1300. Okay, it was the Medici Bank. He was the governor of Florence, and Italy at that time was a loose confederation of principalities, Genoa, Venice, Milan, all these different things, Genoa. And he wanted to unify or control Italy. So what he did was he loaned money to Italy, to the prince in the principality. He had a bank up here, and he would loan money to the prince. Isn't this exciting? Now, we all know how that works. If the prince can't pay the loan back, then he gets the prince's country. See how that works? Is this fun? You ever see anybody that couldn't make their car payment? They have this little tow truck comes out and tows it away. See? Isn't that fun? See, this is called kingdom towing. Okay? And what they do is they tow your country away. We now understand poli-sci. That's all there is to political science. That's it. Okay? The process is called war. Every war that I know of that's been fought in the last 400 years has been over a money issue. It was never fought by governments or by people. It was fought for the benefit of banks. All we have to know is who the bank is, and we can understand war. Sometimes they own oil. Okay, now, so what happens here is that the bank comes along. So about 1400 now, about 100 years of this, Medici's conquering this and conquering that, and every time he loans money, he has to have a big battle. So he conquered an area called Pisa in Italy, and it had a finance minister by the name of Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a young man. He was put in exile on his property back in Pisa, and if he left his property, he was subject to be executed. All right? Machiavelli wrote a proposal to the Medici Bank, and he said, you guys have got this thing pretty good, but it could be better. This is a pretty brash thing for this guy to say, because he could have been executed at whim. And he said, every time you loan money and get one of these principalities from the prince, you have to have a war. And every time you're at risk, every time it costs you a lot of money, every time it's a lot of work. He said, if you made me the number 2 man in the Medici Empire, now this guy's in exile, you know. Okay? He said, if you made me number 2 man, I will show you how you can confiscate every country in the world and you'll never have a war. Well, do you think this got Medici's attention? So they brought him in, and he said, now look, he said, you make me number 2 man. He says, if this doesn't work, you can cut off my head. This guy was a real gambler. He says, if it works, I'm number 2. And they said, okay. And they said, what's your plan? He says, well, it's not just a plan. You got to do it. And they said, okay. What we're going to do, we're going to introduce a concept of balance of power. They said, balance of power? They said, yeah, balance of power. You've heard this phrase. We hear it all the time. Henry Kissinger uses it. George Bush uses it. Balance of power. I guess he uses New World Order, doesn't he, or something? Okay, same thing. All right. Now, so George, read my lips, Bush. Okay? You know, you can always tell when George is lying. His lips move. Okay, now, so we don't call him George Bush. We call him George Shrub. We don't feel he's mature enough to be a Bush. Okay, so anyway, what happens here is that, okay, because you see, all he's doing is he's fronting for somebody else, isn't he? You haven't noticed it? All right? George is not his own man. All right. We'll explain. That's our... We haven't got to the funny part yet. Okay, that's next hour. All right, there you go. Okay. So he said, what you're going to do now is you're going to loan money to 2 princes. And they said, are you crazy? And he says, got to do it. Got to do it. If it doesn't work, then... And they said, well, all right. So they loaned money to 2 princes. Isn't this exciting? They loaned money to Prince A and to Prince B both. And the condition was that the princes had to repay the loan. They couldn't pay it back with money that they printed, so the bank would run the money in the country here. So they would print the money, you see, control the money. All the speeches by the prince now had to be approved by the bank because it was imperative that the people, the rabble down here, didn't catch on that the prince was no longer running the country for their benefit, but for the benefit of a bank. This must never be disclosed, you see. And so the speeches are written up here, and they're read down here. Get it? Okay? It's not always easy to find good speech readers. Sometimes they have to go to Hollywood. Okay, now, and so then we have war. Okay, so now we have a war. This guy has to go to war whenever he's told to go to war. So he reads a speech, and oh, what do you know? We're at war. Let's see. I guess we'll give him an ultimatum. You got till Saturday. When Saturday comes now, you've got till Wednesday. Okay, now, okay, no, we just discussed the war in Iraq. All right, now, what happens here is that I've just described to you the 4 identifying characteristics of the Federal Reserve System in the United States for the last 82 years. It's precisely what the Federal Reserve System has been doing with our government. It owns our government. Our government does whatever the bank wants because, you see, when the bank started printing money without any backing, it was called a debt. And we pick up the interest on it. It's called the national debt. Why would we have a debt if we print our own money? Doesn't make any sense, does it? If you had a printing press in your basement, would you be in debt? See, it's not our press anymore. It belongs to the Bank of England because now we're in debt and we can't print our own money. They print it. It's been going on since 1913. You may have heard about it. It's called inflation. See, notice if you do it, it's called counterfeiting. They have a little school up in the state here. It's called San Quentin, and they give the first offense, like, what is it, 17 years of remedial printing. See, they'll teach you not to print. You can print menus and newspapers, but not money. Only they can print the money. We'll talk about who they are in our third hour, too, by the way. It's not a mysterious they. It's actually 6 families. Okay? It's financial families, all right? Interesting stuff. Okay, so notice what's been going on here. We now have a central bank. This differs from a national bank because until the year 1400, all that was on the planet was national banks. In other words, the bank was run by the government. Well, the government is going to have a debt to itself, so national debt was unknown of, virtually unknown of. Never unheard of. Nobody ever heard of it. Now, you see, the bank is no longer run by anybody in the government. Matter of fact, it's probably not even run by anybody in the country here. And we have a debt. And it keeps getting bigger all the time, doesn't it? Now, I have a lot of fun when I go out to a restaurant. I get finished and I go up to the waitress and I say, listen, may I talk to the manager because all I have with me are notes. And she says, what? I said, yeah, I ate this dinner and all I got are some notes. Would your manager take a note? She says, well, I don't know. Go get the manager. Says, would you take a note, sir? Yeah, what do you mean? I said, well, I came here and I had this dinner and it was very nice and I appreciate it. And I certainly don't want to steal from you, but all I have with me are some notes. Could you possibly take a note? And he says, well, what do you mean? I said, well, let me show you. And I pull this out here, and I show him these notes that I have, see? Because now if I bought a car from, your name is John? If I bought a car from John and I gave him a note, could John buy anything with that note? Well, he might be able to get it to the bank, and maybe if my reputation is good, he could borrow it, right? But notice the note is not money, is it? Notice carefully. The note is not money, because the note is in place of money. The note is something that you give somebody when you don't have any money. You notice carefully? The Federal Reserve System has printed $1 here, and it says Federal Reserve Note. Notice carefully, it doesn't say Federal Reserve Money, because there isn't any. Now, when $1 is printed, it is a debt. The debt is what you pay, and it's called the national debt. Are we having fun now? Do you understand why anybody who writes anything that makes any sense in an economics exam in any government school in the country would flunk? Because economics in school is designed to cover all this up so you don't know what's going on. Now, this sounds radical, and it is. The question is it true? If it's not true, let me know, and hey, I'll stop all this and go get a job, okay? Now, but if it's true, then we have trouble in River City, don't we? Okay, so your job today is to find out, okay, is this really true? Okay, and we're not asking for any immediate response. It's pretty wild, I'm sure, for many people. All right, we have just described central banking. A central bank is where a foreign bank or a private bank can put a nation in debt. When the nation is in debt, the nation is the poor borrower. Isn't that interesting? And the lender is the ruler. Got the picture? The president reads what he writes. Well, this goes along. It runs pretty well. Medici became very wealthy, became very powerful. They went into all of Europe. Catherine de' Medici ran France, and one of the Medicis went up into the Scandinavian countries. But the family died out in the 1650s because they got a little bit too hung up on money. It seems that they decided no one else could marry in the family except Medicis. And this caused a little genetic problem. And pretty soon their eyes wouldn't go in the same direction. They foamed at the mouth and a few little things like that. And as far as I know, there aren't any Medicis around anymore. I think they all went to bananas, okay? Now, so they just kind of died out. But the history is impeccable. They were the most powerful family that had ever lived on the face of the earth as a result of control through debt. By the way, if you are into the Bible, you'll read the first 5 books of the Bible. One thing is to be avoided at all costs, and that's debt. Never get involved in usury. Pay enough interest, okay? Matter of fact, the old Jewish people, they had the Old Testament, they had the year of Jubilee, where all debts were removed every 50 years, no matter how much was owed, and everybody started over, so that the land would never be moved from one family to another, because the land was to be held in perpetuity. That was exactly what our founding fathers gave us in America One. That's why they called it unalienable rights. That means you own that property in perpetuity. Nobody, banks, governments, armies, nobody can take this away from you. Isn't this exciting? Did you know that in Southern California last year more homes were repossessed than were purchased? See, this is America 2. It's the reverse of America 1, isn't it? Everything America 1 gave you, Government 2 is taking away. Got it? And it's your choice which one you want to belong to. We're going to explain that, because this gets to be interesting. All right? So along comes a fellow at 1740 by the name of Meyer Bauer. Very brilliant man. I don't think history is an accident. I think it's made by brilliant men. And he, by the time he was 16, had graduated from school, from college. By the time he was 20, he was the finance minister for the King of Austria. And he thought in his mind, well, the reason the guy is the King of Austria is because he's the one with the gold. This is sometimes referred to as the Golden Rule. All right? And he said now all he'd have to do to be a ruler himself is to get that gold. And so he made some surreptitious loans, some secret loans to Germany through a couple of families in Germany named the Cassel and the Hess households up there, because if the non-German could not loan money to the king. But through these brokers, these German brokers up there, he was able to loan money to King Frederick. And pretty soon, King Frederick was in debt to our friend Meyer Bauer. At this point, Meyer Bauer, a couple things happen. First of all, the King of Austria realizes there's no more gold in the treasury, so he goes into self-proclaimed exile in Denmark, where Shakespeare writes in Hamlet, by the way, be sure to see the movie, it's a good one, that there's now something rotten in Denmark. Okay, now, also, the King Frederick would read these speeches. And every time he'd read these speeches, well, he'd be deeper in debt and have more wars. Isn't that interesting? He became a very excellent reader, I should point out. Probably one of the best readers in history. He was such a good reader that he is now called Frederick the Great. Okay? Because he was a great reader. All right? And whatever Meyer wrote, Fred spoke. And Germany was involved in war after endless war, and all the young blood of Germans had died all over collecting debts for Meyer. Isn't this exciting? The only thing that's necessary is that the German people must never catch on what Freddie's doing. Oh, Freddie got all this money. I mean, after all, he had this little carriage, little bumper sticker on, shop till you drop. He liked to buy things, And Meyer was always there. How much do you want? Isn't this great? And all he had to do was read speeches. Hey, was this a good deal or what? See, it was only imperative that the people not catch on what was going on. And so for 200 years, the German people were military people, going to war after war, all the young people dying in the battlefields, and what a bunch of nonsense. Got the picture? Notice that's been happening in America for 80 years, too. We go to all these interesting places on the planet, like Vietnam and Iraq, isn't this great? To protect ourselves from all these bad guys. Okay, we'll be getting to that next hour. It gets worse. Okay. Now, so then he looks across the channel over here, and lo and behold, here's Prince George over here. Well, George was actually from the House of Hanover, strangely enough. He wasn't really pure German, or pure English. Isn't that interesting? And Meyer goes over there, and of course, he had the Merchant Bank of Hamburg over here, and interesting stuff, you see. Here's the world's richest country, the most powerful army in the world, hadn't been defeated for 300 years. And Meyer goes over and wants to know if he needs any help. Well, how kings are. They always need more money, don't they? And it wasn't very long until George got in debt to... I should point out that Meyer, by the way, when he took over Germany, to make sure that the name Bauer, which is a Hungarian name, because they didn't want to know that anybody in Germany was a foreigner, he changed his name to Red Star. Isn't that interesting? Now, you've heard of Meyer Red Star, haven't you? Oh, I'm sorry, the translation is Rothschild. Okay, Meyer Rothschild, or Red Shield, Red Star, okay? You'll notice in all the communist countries they have little red stars. See, well, another existential event. There is no reason, it just happened. Sure. Okay? See, if we understand history, it gets to be pretty interesting, because it's all economics, isn't it? Who's got the bucks? Okay? So, George goes over here and he gets in debt. He can't repay the loan. Uh-oh, repo time. So Meyer goes over and says, repo depot, George. And he says, I'm going to have to run the Bank of Germany. By the way, he's still running, or Bank of England. By the way, he's still running the Bank of England. When Meyer went over to run the Bank of England, he never laughed. He's still there. Isn't this interesting? It's the 13 square blocks of downtown London. England is not run from London. as far as the government is concerned, the government's out of Westminster. The Queen lives in Westminster, she's crowned in Westminster, and so forth and so on. The government of England is in Westminster. What's in London is the bank. If the Queen wants to go to London downtown, she can't go in unless she has prior appointment, because that's where her employer lives. And she must bow and curtsy, you see, if she wants to get some more money, because that's how it works. Well, George couldn't pay all the money back to our friend Meyer, okay? So Meyer goes over and he says, well, George, he says, what seems to be the problem here? Why is the world's richest country having a problem paying my debt? And so he says, let's take a look at the books. He goes back and he takes a look at the books, and after a few months he says, George, I noticed some interesting things. Back here in 1620, a bunch of guys took off in the Mayflower, and he says, George, I haven't seen any entries for their rent. He says, where is the rent, George, for the colonies? And George says, well, sir, he says, they don't really think they're colonists. They don't think it is a colony. And so they were a bunch of religious nuts, a bunch of malcontents, and we just said good riddance. And matter of fact, we let everybody out of prison, and they went over and started a thing over there called Georgia. And so the interesting stuff, which is true. And so we just let all these guys out, so then we eased our expenses. We didn't have so many expenses, see? But they would never send us any rent. And he says, well, George, he says, there you have your problem. He says, the solution is that you want them to pay rent. After all, just stop and think, George, if they paid the rent, you could pay your debt. And George says, God, smartest guy in the world. Why didn't I think of that? See? Sure enough, see? And he said, I'll send the army over right away. And Meyer says, George, please sit down. He says, good grief, no wonder you're just a king. He says, let me explain how you repossess a country. He says, armies are not the way you repossess a country. He says, armies only are good for collecting debts. He says, because to repossess a country, they're too expensive, they're hard to control, they're too visible, and they cause a lot of resistance. He says, George, armies are not good. And George said, oh. And so he said, George, let me explain how you repossess a country. George said, oh, goody, sir. Please explain. Okay, and so Meyer explained it. And George, of course, was a very good student, and it wasn't very long. Matter of fact, in the next 5 years, George levied 120 taxes on the colonies. He levied hat taxes, tea taxes, stamp taxes, fur taxes, shoe taxes, leather taxes. Everything was taxed. Isn't that interesting? The way you repossess countries, the way you repossess property is through tax. You want to get somebody's property, you don't beat them over the head, because they'll come back and beat you over the head. That's very messy. You tax them. And they say, oh, here's my property, and they give it to you. We now understand government. All right? So they sent and so meanwhile the George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, these guys are here. Every time they'd wake up, they'd read the morning paper, and there'd be another tax. And they said, good grief, this keeps up, we're going to have to lose our land. So they went up to Philadelphia, and they had a couple little meetings called Continental Congresses, and they decided that they wouldn't pay these taxes. Isn't that funny? See, they got some little bumper stickers on their chariots that said, just say no. And so, as a matter of fact, when the British wanted to tax the tea up in Boston, they went up and they dumped all the tea into the ocean. Well, this was a very significant event, okay? Because now that meant that there was a debt. So over comes the debt collectors. Isn't that interesting? The debt collectors now come over from England. You could always spot debt collectors in those days very easily because they wore red suits. And the Americans had a very novel, imaginative, and creative solution to this problem. They shot them. Well, this was considered sort of a joke, because here was an army that hadn't been defeated for 300 years, coming over in total from Europe, and a bunch of ragtag farmers, because there was only 4% of the people that didn't want to pay their taxes. 96% said, let's pay them. It's not a whole lot different from today. And the 4%, no, we're going to get our guns and we're going to fight them. And they fought him. Well, this wasn't going to take too long, you see. But there are some surprises in this little thing, okay? It's called the Cold War, because the Americans were basically private enterprise-oriented, and the British weren't. And so what the British would do, if he won this war, he would go back to England, and he would be a serf for the lord and the manor again. He was fighting, literally, for his own slavery. And so the guys over here in America, like Nathan Green, Nathaniel Green, and the Green Mountain Boys, and so forth, they were real estate guys, okay? And So what they did is they offered a package. They got a little presentation package for these guys. And they said, listen, any British soldier that comes into town on weekends or evenings and produces evidence that he is a deserter will get an immediate title to 160 acres of prime farmland in the Shenandoah and Appalachian Valley. Ever notice that? The whole East Coast from Maine down to Florida is sectioned into 160-acre parcels. It was given to the British Army. And every time General Cornwallis had reveille, there would be another company missing. You've heard the old phrase, suppose they gave a war and nobody came? That happened. It was called Yorktown, 1781. The British did not have enough men show up. Here was the British now, faced with an enemy that had never won a major battle and that was freezing to death in the winters, and it was half naked and barefoot. And now listen, for the first time in 300 years, the British surrender to this enemy. That's a strange thing, isn't it? Why would Cornwallis surrender his sword to Washington? He had no troops, did he? Isn't this fun? Notice, this was not a military victory. It was a real estate transaction. We refer to it as Century 18. Notice how carefully censored this is from any government school course on history. Because this would totally upset Johnny and make him maladjusted. This would not be good. So to protect Johnny, he's not taught this. You do understand that that's for his benefit. See? Because what it showed was internal control was more powerful than external control. And whenever that's shown in history, it's not taught. We now know how history textbooks are written. History textbooks are written so that when you go to school for 12 years, you are so mind-numbed with external control that you don't know anything else. And you've now been adjusted. Well, this is interesting. You see, because now these guys went on and they designed a Declaration of Independence. Now, and all this stuff, this is pretty wild. Because they said, listen, we don't want to have any of these problems like they had over in Europe. We don't want to have any of this external control stuff. Is this fun or what? Thomas Jefferson, I believe, is the father of our government. Washington is the father of our country. But the government pretty much was designed by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a student of John Locke. John Locke was an old Presbyterian over in England, and he did a lot of writing on this business of internal control stuff. This is not my idea. Okay? Okay, and what he said was that, well, a lot of this stuff, but he went into Isaiah chapter 22, verse 11, and it said that God is my lawmaker, my judge, and my king. And he says, what Oliver Cromwell had done back in 1640, remember when he took over and cut off the king's head, Charles I, who was James's son, because he wouldn't give up this divine right of kings thing. There wasn't any divine right after he cut his head off. His blood was red, it wasn't blue, and it flowed like everybody's. And nobody came up with this idea of divine right of kings again. That was strictly hogwash that the Stuart kings came up with. You see? But he was executed, the first king in history was ever executed for violating the law. He had violated the Magna Carta. He'd confiscated the noble's property without a jury trial. He'd started what was called a Star Chamber Court, and he had regents and chancellors that he named and so forth. It was sort of like a tax court today. No jury. If you accept that, you've accepted America too. You guys are accepting it every day. See, we're talking about where the cheese really binds here in our next hour, how all this comes together. You see, because there's this big dichotomy going on, two countries running simultaneously in the same place at the same time. Oh boy. And the boys have a problem because they can't implement the external control as long as you know that there's internal control. Oh, you can really make them upset. Okay, now, you can spoil their day. Okay, now, okay, see, where were we? Oh yes, Thomas Jefferson. Okay? So along comes Locke, and he reads in Isaiah that God is my judge, my lawgiver, my king. And he says, because what Oliver Cromwell had done is he said, what you need now are to run along with the king are two houses of parliament. See? And so he was close, but it collapsed. See? And so along come these guys 100 years later now, and they've got Cromwell to look at. George Washington's idea of beating the government army, beating the British army, was not new because Oliver Cromwell had done it in 1640. You see, Oliver Cromwell had been the leader of Parliament. And the king disbanded Parliament. He says, we don't want Parliament. We don't want all this Magna Carta. He disbanded Parliament, you see. And so Parliament went to war with the king. Isn't this interesting? 1640. It was the British Civil War. And Parliament won. After all these years, it took about 7 years, after Oliver Cromwell got involved, the British Army never won another battle. He'd never been in the military. He was 40 years old when he started, and he never lost a battle. He never retreated a foot. To read Oliver Cromwell's history is absolutely staggering. He did the totally impossible thing. He beat the king and cut his head off. So Washington, these guys says, well, hey, that's been done before. This is no big deal. Besides, we're 3,000 miles away. See? But what Cromwell did is he set up the two houses of Parliament with the king. Okay. Now, and he didn't have a king. He has what was called a protector. He started a title charged a protector. We'll come back to that in English law because there's a protector involved in trust. So we're going to be talking about trust our third hour. And you want your trust under English law to have a, and English law is the basis, by the way, for United States law because it's based upon the Magna Carta, which the Constitution is also. Okay, but anyway, so along comes Thomas Jefferson reading John Locke, and he says what we need are three houses, no king and three houses. You see, the executive, legislative, and judicial. Isn't that interesting? Because this all comes out of the Bible. See all this stuff? That's why they couldn't read the Bible? All this power right in one book. It's incredible, right? And so they said, okay, what we'll do is we'll come up with a Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence says we're endowed by our Creator with these unalienable rights of life, liberty, and property, and they're given to us, okay, the people, and then the government is instituted among men to secure these rights. Isn't that interesting? Now, what made this so interesting, it was exactly upside down from all previous history. Just turn this thing around, and you've got everything that happened before. You see? You've got the government telling the people what to do. The rights are somewhere down below. They don't even have any, and the Creator, well, that was something they could pick or choose from, but it didn't have any effect on government. You see the difference? Now, it said there's a natural law. Jefferson in the Declaration talks about a natural law of man, of which by birth he has rights to life, liberty, and property, and the governments don't even have anything to do with it. Matter of fact, governments are there just simply to secure it. Nothing happens to this guy and his property. Well, that's a pretty good purpose for government, isn't it? Too bad it changed in 1913, isn't it? Look at the progress that concept created. It was incredible, you see. So in 1775, we had a war. Okay, in 1776, we have a Declaration of Independence. Okay, in 1787, we have a Constitution. The Constitution simply put the Declaration of Independence into legal form. It was not a popular document because it didn't limit government. So in 1791, we had the Bill of Rights which limited government. The first amendment, the first 10 amendments, the first one says that government shall make no law establishing religion or regulating anything thereof. Okay, it can't even regulate a church. Okay, and the Second Amendment says the government can't take away our guns because what do we protect ourselves against? Government. Smoke the guy off the front porch. He doesn't take your property. It's very simple. They can't get the property, they'll get the guns. A lot of truth to that. That's why the big emphasis to register your guns, because that's the next step to getting the property. All right, then you've got, this comes along, and in 1791, unfortunately, they also started a bank. Two-thirds of it were the Rothschild Bank of England loaning money to its colonies because they were so happy with these colonies having defeated the British Army and everything. But you see, there's only two dangers that you have to your property. One is an army, and one is a bank. The only way you can lose your property is war or debt. Isn't that interesting? Otherwise, you're securing your property, aren't you? Okay, the government was to make sure that the war and the bank both couldn't take our property. That was the function of government. Oh, boy. Well, in 1791, they went ahead with the bank, but Jefferson didn't like this bank, and he introduced a clause where it had to be renewed in 20 years. So in 1811, the charter for the bank was renewed, or it was up for renewal, and his disciple, James Madison, said, no, we don't want this bank. And they canceled the bank. They actually canceled a central bank. Nobody ever done that before. Just said, no, we don't want it. Isn't that interesting? Let's see now. What happened in 1812? Oh, yes. The Army came back. What a surprise. The Army came back. Yes, okay. What do you know? What do you know? The Army came back and we had a war. The war was over in 1815 because in 1816 they started another bank. Is that clear? I'm skipping a lot of history. There's a lot of details that are interesting here, but we just don't have time to go into them. Let's see if I can get another blue pen, or are we out of them here? Maybe I'll just write with a black one. I don't like black, but the blue's kind of going on us. Well, Jefferson, or Jackson, is so angry, General Jackson, who defeated the British in New Orleans, he is so angry about this. In 1828, he runs for the presidency, and in good grief. Well, let's see, I'll take a bunch of them here. Maybe one of these works. I get one that works, I'll put the pile down. Okay. Okay, he was so angry that in 1832, he cancels the bank. No bank. Is that interesting? Well, it takes care of that one. Those two. Okay, stay tuned. The suspense is incredible. Okay, no bank. Okay. All right. Is there a drugstore in the area? Okay, now. Okay, so, but then we had another war in 1860. Isn't this interesting? 1860 war. You say, well, what does that mean? Well, notice that there is a history. We're taught that there's no pattern to history. It's just random events. Well, let's take a look at these random events. What did they lead up to? Well, it says that there was a bank, no bank war, bank, no bank war. All the banks were British, all the armies were British. Got the picture? What a coincidence. What a shock. We go to school and we get all confused thinking that England and France are some of our enemies, and Britain's always coming to our aid, all this nonsense. See, history is to cover this up. Adjustment is when you don't know what happened. In the Civil War, that was an interesting picture because you had basically the bank, which is the city, the 13 blocks downtown London, which is called the city. It's still called the city. It's a code name. Any bank with the name city in it is a Rothschild bank. Isn't that interesting? So Citibank, Citicorp, City Land, all these things. It's a little code name, so you can understand it. So the bank has an inside. Okay, what they did in the Civil War was they controlled 5 different countries. They controlled Germany. Okay, they controlled England. They controlled France through Napoleon, and we don't have time to play into all that. The Napoleonic Wars are real interesting. Italy and Austria. Okay, the banks were in all of these places. Matter of fact, if you see Germany is here, England's over here, Paris is down here, Italy's over here, Austria's over here. If you draw a line to all of the central banks in Europe, it forms a red star. Go home on your European map and draw it. It's real interesting. Okay? All right. Just a little coincidence, I'm sure. George Catlin Marshall was a big hero in 1940 because he designed our headquarters for our armed services. And it's a place east of Washington, D.C., and it's called a Pentagon. And we have a star in this country, don't we? Is this fun? George was really a great guy. We'll get into George maybe a little bit later if we have time. Okay, notice there are 2 countries missing in the Civil War, the United States and Russia. These 2 countries got together and defeated the bank in 1860. We'll come to that later. We won't get into that right now. We're going to go back a little bit and talk some more here. Okay, about this. The bank did not have the control over the country that it wanted because there was no central bank here. Matter of fact, that's why the war was fought. We wouldn't accept a central bank. We now understand history. The rest is detail. Okay? It's like flying over the Grand Canyon. You've now seen it. If you want to go back with a pack mule and a little hammer and some, whatever you can, because there's a lot more to it, but you've seen it. You now know what Grand Canyon looks like. Okay? Now, so that's history. Okay, history is simply the money. Okay? Now, unfortunately, this is not all that took place during this period of time, because over in Bavaria in 1776, the boys in the bank realized that they could not conquer countries through military control. This just would not work. So in 1776, actually back in 1462, Ignatius Loyola had begun an organization called the Illuminati. The Illuminati was a part, and he also was the creator of the Jesuit order. The Jesuit order has been in and out of favor with the Pope for centuries. And it's called, they have what's called the Black Mass and a few things like this. They do some things the Pope doesn't like, including run the Vatican Bank. And if you really want to see a very, very good motion picture on the subject, it's Godfather 3. Because it talks about when the Vatican Bank needs money, it goes to the mob. Now, what happens with the mob? Well, it has a guy that has a chair now on the bank, doesn't it? See, and what happens? So forth and so on. Because it's an interesting intermixture of bank and or church and non-church play. Okay. And by the way, there was a fellow came over by the name of Giannini, A.P. Giannini, back around the turn of the century, And he started a bank over here. Does anybody know what the name of the bank was? Bank of Italy. It was the Bank of Italy. And in the 20s, they had a name change. What's it called today? Bank of America. Is this fun? Got it? See, the boys are still playing, aren't they? Okay. It is not as strong as a bank as it used to be, because a couple of years ago, until Clausen came back from his meeting with the Trilateral, his chair on the Trilateral Commission and so forth, the bank was going into debt. You remember that? They were almost broke here about 4 years ago. And now they're back on the track, okay? It seems that the Federal Reserve Bank can get guarantees from the government on its loan to foreign governments, and the Bank of America couldn't. There was something going on. Clausen comes back, and now Bank of America, our government will guarantee their loans. See? It's under new management. Okay? So now we understand banking, we understand war. So hey, we're making some progress, serious progress. All right, we had an organization here that they infiltrated this Illuminati in 11. This was your bank, guys. And they created a fellow named Adam Weishaupt here. And they put it under basically the control of the bank. It went ahead and infiltrated the Masonic order in Paris, the Grand Orient Lodge and so forth. They tried to infiltrate the Scottish Rite movement in England, and there was a fellow by the name of John Robeson who was so upset with this, he wrote a book called Proofs of the Conspiracy and blew the Illuminati away. He was the top Scottish Rite master in England at the time, and he wrote a book, just an excellent book. And if you have time for all these books, that's fine. You know, it took me 10 years to read them all, but I'm sure glad I did. All right, but at any rate, they tried to infiltrate England, and that didn't happen right away as far as that was concerned. But what they did was they created what was called the League of the Just Men. They also started the French Revolution. In 1791, you had the French Revolution. The French Revolution was the prototype. If you understand the French Revolution, you understand all these so-called socialist or communist revolutions that have taken place ever since. The king was not even involved in it. The French people weren't even involved in it. It was a foreign group of people that were brought in from the southern Mediterranean, and they were dressed up like French people, and they were all laughing because men were dressed up like women and everything, and then they went and they stormed the Bastille and they cut the king's head off. A few miles away, guys were farming. The French people didn't know anything what was going on. We're taught in history this was the French people rising up against their king. The king simply would not have a bank. After the French Revolution, France had a bank. And they put their revolutionary functionaries in there, Robespierre, Danton, Saint-Just, Marat, and they kept guillotining these guys until they ended up with Napoleon in 1801. And he was a 24-year-old general. It seems that 24-year-old generals don't ask many questions. They just do what they're told, don't they? He went ahead and conquered Italy and Austria, put them under the Rothschild influence. Of course, then he came back, wanted to be king of France, and he was exiled in England because they didn't want him king of France. And he came back to take over France, and he was going to work with Wellington out of England. And of course, Wellington attacked him, surprise, and that was called Waterloo. When Nixon tried to do it, they called it Watergate. Okay, so anyway, you see, you don't go back on the boys when you start playing their game. You just don't do it. It's considered bad. They own you if you play ball with them. And the revolution always eats its own, as we can see with our Senator Cranston, who now has some serious problems and can't run for re-election again. He's out of favor with the bank. Okay, and of course we can go to the savings and loans, and all it is putting them under the Federal Reserve System because they weren't. You see, anytime there's a problem, well, our taxes take care of it, and the boys go under the control of the Red Star. Is this fun or what? Okay, now we understand federal savings and loans. Hey, we're moving. Okay, now 1791. Okay, in 1812 they created an organization called the League of the Just Men after Saint Just, one of the conspirators up here, and their plan was to come up with a program that would have people all over the world voluntarily give up their property to the bank. And this, of course, took some serious thinking. This took many, many years of talking and planning and so forth. And finally, by 1832, there was a fellow in the United States in New York by the name of Clinton Roosevelt. Clinton Roosevelt came up with a plan that he thought would enable this bank to control all the property in the world. And he put it in a little booklet, and he mailed it over to the Bank of England. And his plan called for, number one, the abolition of all private property. Isn't that interesting? The abolition of private property. He said this would be done in the next 9 platforms. The first one would be a heavy, progressive, graduated income tax. And he said the next one would be so that if a guy made any money, he couldn't keep it. The next one would be inheritance tax. So if he had any property, he couldn't give it to the next generation. It would have to be given back to the bank, which is controlled by the government, which is controlled by the bank. The fourth platform was a confiscation of all property of rebels. A rebel is identified as anyone who doesn't pay the first two taxes. You've heard of tax rebel? It's not a new term, is it? You see? Okay, the fifth platform was that there would be a central bank. In other words, the boys would have to go in and print the money. It wouldn't be printed from inside the country. And to spare you the agony, I'll just go down to the 10th platform, that the government would run all schools. Isn't that interesting? That was the platform, okay? It was sent over there, and there was a fellow named Engels who was the head of the Rothschild Bank in Vienna, in Austria, and he had a son by the name of Frederick. And so they said, well, look, we'll have this guy write this up, introduce it in England, and we'll call it the Communist Manifesto. Isn't that interesting? So the bank produced their document to confiscate all land, and they said, first of all, it has to look like it's not a bank. So they said, okay, we want to make it look like it's a popular movement. Okay? But they said, well, it still doesn't look like a popular movement because this guy's the banker's kid. And they said, aha, what we need is some guy that can put this over. So in 1867, the first manuscript that ever came along with Karl Marx's name on it. Isn't that interesting? And now Karl Marx is credited with having written the document. He wrote that document about as much as he wrote the LA phone book. Okay? He just simply put his name on because they needed a diversion. They needed a distraction to show that this was not a bank repossessing property. This was actually a hippie movement, if you will, of people that just wanted to own everything in common. Oh, really? Interesting. All right. From 1867 until 1913, every year the income tax was introduced in the United States. And every year it failed. 66 years go by. Every year, income tax failed, income tax failed, income tax failed. Finally, the Supreme Court in 1895 said, look, even if the income tax passes in the United States, it can't pass because it's a direct tax. See, what happened here was back in the days of our founding times here, our fathers in their wisdom did some interesting things. And they said that they realized that they had, 13 separate countries over here. They had Connecticut, Vermont, Rhode Island, Virginia, Delaware, New York, and Ring. And so, historically, these countries would have problems if they didn't have some type of a central government here to stop the smuggling, to make sure there were no trade embargoes, and so forth. So they realized that there had to be some regulation from inside. Now, the problem is they did not want this government to be the sovereign. They said, we want the sovereign up here, okay? We want the sovereign, or the ruler, as Solomon says, to be the citizens in the states. Now, how could you make it so that the government now, in other words, if this were the citizens, how could you make it so that the government was the servant? And this is the kind of government they gave us. And they said, okay, what we have to do is make sure that the servant cannot tax a master. So that's one of the conditions, that the servant cannot tax the master. And they said, well, how are we going to fund this government? And they said, aha, it's going to be an indirect tax or a transactional tax, and you can tax transactions such as business and sales. But you can't tax a master in his income or his property. Isn't that interesting? And so they had written in the Constitution that they could tax on excise, imposts, tariffs, duties, and these things. They're enumerated. What is a legal tax, you see? Notice income tax is not there. We're up to 1913 or up to 1912, income tax doesn't show up, okay? And so when the Supreme Court came along and said, look, you guys are trying to pass a tax from the master on, from the servant on the master, and even if you did it, the Supreme Court's going to throw it out. So back to the drawing board. These guys were busy, because, hey, there's nothing more profitable than running a country like the United States. So they had plenty of time, plenty of money to put this together. So they said, what we need to do then is change the Constitution. We have to change that aspect so it's okay for the servant to tax his master. They introduced it in 1913 as the 16th Amendment. They couldn't get anybody hardly to do it. They finally passed it through 4 state legislatures, but they had control by that time of the school system, and they had control of the news media, so nobody knew it. There's a book out called The Law That Never Was by William Benson. William Benson has been imprisoned. He's been given drugs. He's been brutally tortured in an Illinois prison. Probably, I don't know if he's still alive or not. But the publishing of this book cost him his life in 1990. We're not talking 1763. We're talking 1990. The boys don't like it when you publish this information. They get mad. See? All right? And he showed that the law was never ratified by more than 4 state legislatures. And it was supposed to have been ratified by, I don't know, 18 or 19. Didn't quite make it, did it? But we don't know it because we get the news that they want us to get, and we go to the schools that they want us to go to. And that's where we get our information. Is this fun or what? And they got Waltons and Daltons all tied up. You can't get anything in the bookstores, okay? Okay, interesting stuff. Okay, this was a con job right from the start, con job. Now, once we understand that that's what income tax is, now we're ready to cope with it. Okay, it's an illegal thing. It doesn't even exist. What have you misspelled sovereign? Good, it says me in here. Okay. Okay. All right. So they tried to get the income tax in. They couldn't get it in for 66 years now, every year. Now, the problem was that they had these senators that didn't want to pass this. The Senate wouldn't pass it, see? Now, we have to, first of all, take a look at the 17th Amendment. Okay? Because the 17th Amendment is the election of senators. In the original Constitution, or Constitution for America 1, it said that, okay, if you wanted to have the senator was the control that a state legislature had on the federal government. Okay? And for 66 years, the state governments kept sending their guy to Washington and saying, no, we don't want a federal income tax. Why would Louisiana or why would Ohio want a federal income tax? So they kept blowing this thing out of the water, you see. And so they said, okay, what we have to do is change the representation of the Senate. Now, they call it the direct election of the senators. I mean, direct election of senators certainly sounds good, doesn't it? But let's take a look at what it really is, okay? My dad, wise that he was, when I was in high school and I got my first job, he says, I'd like to explain something to you. He says, this is a paycheck. And he says, the employee receives the paycheck, okay? And this is the amount. And he says, it's signed by the boss. He says, it's really a very simple system. He says, if you want another paycheck, you just make this guy happy. But his job is not to make you happy. He says, you have any problems? He says, remember that. He says, because you're there for his benefit. He's not there for yours. Got the picture? That's the relationship between a boss and an employee. Now, before 1917, okay, the employee was the U.S. Senator. And the boss was the state legislature. So if the state had something going on in the federal it didn't like, it would have the senator cancel it. Isn't that interesting? In 1917, they changed bosses. From 1913 on, it's no longer the state legislature, it's the federal government. The senator no longer represents the state government, he represents the federal government. That's why when you write your state senator like Red Cranston, we call him Red Cranston because that's not his color of his hair, but that's the color of his voting record. Okay, what happens here is that he always explains to you why he votes the way you don't want him to vote. He never really says, oh yes, that's the way I should do it. He has not voted for the benefit of California. He's voted for the benefit of the central bank ever since he's been there. He knows where the bread's buttered. And the state for the last 80 years has had no representation at all. It's totally powerless. Isn't that interesting? You see, this had to happen before they could get an income tax. The second thing they did was they had to change the 16th Amendment, which said, okay, now you can have a direct tax. Now it's okay for the servant to tax his master. Well, if the servant can tax his master, you've just had a role reversal, haven't you? You've just had a change of master, that's all. That's interesting, isn't it? See, that's like the old Aesop's fable about the donkey, that the guy was going off and he's leaving the donkey, he was selling the farm and left the donkey, and he says, well, I suppose you're glad to get rid of me, huh? And the donkey says, well, it doesn't make any difference. Change of ownership doesn't mean freedom. See, isn't that interesting? We just had a change of ownership, didn't we? All right? So these two things happened along with a third thing in 1913. Very bad year. Very bad year. They introduced the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System is simply a central bank. And now the United States government will go into debt to private individuals unnamed and unknown. Well, there was a book written called Secrets of the Federal Reserve back in the 50s by a fellow named Eustace Mullins, probably the finest book on the market as to the Federal Reserve System. Mullins went in and he found out who owned the Federal Reserve System. I won't go into a big long story on it. It was interesting. But the Federal Reserve System is 52% owned by the Rothschild Bank. Isn't that interesting? Out of London. This will start again. I wonder if they got other colors. What do we got here? We'll try a couple more here. Let's see what we got. We got green and red. Let's try that. Okay. Okay, that's 50. Now, meanwhile, you have some other things here. Here's 52% that's owned by, or sorry, 24%, excuse me. 24%. There's got more red ones here too. Okay, 24% owned by by people in the United States, and it's 24% owned by people in Europe. Okay, according to Mullins, okay, there are 4 families that own property that own part of the United States. This is the Goldman Sachs Bank. These are banking families. They're not physical families, but they call themselves banking families. The Goldman Sachs Bank. You've got the Lehman Brothers Bank. You've got the Kuhn Loeb Bank, and you've got the Rockefeller Brothers. Now, over in Europe, you've got 3 families. Okay, you have the Ferrars, I forget what this E-R-E-R or R-E-R-E. Anyway, Ferrars brothers. You've got the Moses Israel Seif out of Rome. This is France. This is Italy. And then out of Hamburg in Germany, you have the Warburg brothers. Isn't that interesting? Germany. Okay? And the Netherlands. Okay, this is the stock ownership of the Federal Reserve System. That's who the owners are. Now, we often get some information that, for example, the Rockefellers are dirty guys and bad guys, and that they really are causing problems in this country. And let's take a look at that. See, the Rockefellers own approximately, I would say, 6%. All these guys own about 6%, something like this. These guys own about 8%, according to my calculations. And this guy owns 52%. Okay, ready? Here's the biggie question. Okay, ready? Question of the day. Who makes the decisions? Interesting, isn't it? Who's the errand boy? Who's the messenger boy that carries it out? And we're fed this guy as the real problem. It takes the heat off all the others, doesn't it? Notice you kill the messenger boy, you really don't kill the message, do you? Okay, interesting stuff. Okay, here is the ownership of the Federal Reserve Bank. These are the boys who make all the money. The interest on the national debt is paid to them. Is this fun? How would you like to receive the interest on the national debt? Is this got to be a good business? Notice that this organization has never been audited and it never produces an annual report. They don't got to show you no stinking podges. Isn't this fun? If you don't pay them, they come and get your house. It's called IRS because that's the name of their collection agency. We now understand taxes to some extent. Okay? Now, I don't have time. Let's see. What are we going here? I guess, how much time have we got in this hour? Is this close to an hour? Let's take a break. We're going to come back, and we're going to show you a little bit of history from the Civil War, or from the 1913 on to the present, as far as the economics are concerned. And then we're going to show you how to really solve this problem by going into showing you how they set it up. There's two things. Just like I gave you a tip last time for the next hour. Okay, the tip to the next hour now. 2 words. There's 2 ways you will never, ever have any problem with IRS. And that is never have an income and never have any assets. Now, what we're going to show you is that all these families here in the United States have no income and they have no assets. It's called trust. So come back next hour. Trust me, you'll enjoy this.